I still remember the cold weight of that plastic bag in my trembling hand. Inside, a bright blue cleaner's uniform, stark against the fine linens and delicate bouquets of my granddaughter's wedding. My own daughter's eyes filled with confusion and hurt as my daughter-in-law's mother smirked and pressed it into her palms like some cruel gift. My sister-in-law laughed, loud and sharp, as if our humiliation was the evening's best entertainment. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share, and if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. The Palmer House Hotel ballroom glittered around us that evening in downtown Chicago. Crystal chandeliers casting dancing shadows on the cream-colored walls. I wore my best navy dress, the one I'd saved for special occasions, with the pearl earrings my mother gave me 40 years ago. My hands shook as I smoothed the fabric, trying to appear composed while my world crumbled in real time. The smell of white roses and baby's breath should have been beautiful, but it mixed with something bitter in the air, the scent of betrayal disguised as celebration. I had arrived early, as always, wanting to help with any last-minute details. That was my role, after all, the helper, the problem solver, the one who quietly made things work while others took the credit. I'd been playing this part for so many years that I'd forgotten there could be any other way to exist in my own family. My phone buzzed against my clutch. A text from my son Marcus. "Mom, can you grab more ice from the kitchen? Sarah's mom forgot to order enough." Even on his daughter's wedding day, even when I was dressed in my finest clothes, trying to be just a grandmother for once, I was still the errand girl, still the one expected to fix what others had overlooked. I found myself walking through the hotel's service corridors, my heels clicking against the polished concrete, carrying bags of ice like some uniformed staff member. The contrast wasn't lost on me. Here I was, in a $500 dress I'd saved months to buy, hauling ice because my daughter-in-law's family couldn't be bothered to handle the details themselves. When I returned to the ballroom, I noticed the photographs displayed on the gift table. 12 years of my granddaughter Emma's life captured in silver frames, birthday parties I'd organized and paid for, Christmas mornings where my gifts dominated the scene while her parents slept late, dance recitals where I sat alone in the audience because Marcus and Sarah had work commitments. In every image, I was there, the constant presence, the reliable grandmother who never missed a moment, never failed to show up, never said no. But looking at those photos now, I saw something different. In each one, my smile looked a little more strained, my eyes a little more tired. When had I started looking like someone who was performing happiness instead of feeling it? The ceremony was beautiful, I'll give them that. Emma looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, Sarah's grandmother, that is. Not mine. My own mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved for decades, had never even been considered. It hung in my closet at home, wrapped in tissue paper and dreams that would never come true. During the reception, I found myself seated at table 9. Not the family table, not even close to it. I was positioned with my husband Robert's cousin from Milwaukee, whom I'd met maybe 3 times in 30 years, and several of Sarah's co-workers who spent the evening discussing people I'd never heard of. From my vantage point, I could see the head table where my son sat with his new in-laws, laughing at jokes I couldn't hear, sharing stories that didn't include me. My daughter Lisa, who'd flown in from Denver, looked equally out of place at table 7. She kept glancing my way with the same confused expression I felt in my own chest. We were spectators at our own family's celebration, watching from the sidelines as others took center stage in our grandchild's most important day. The speeches began after dinner. Sarah's father spoke eloquently about love and family traditions. Her mother shared charming anecdotes about Emma's childhood, events I had witnessed but apparently wasn't considered qualified to speak about. When they asked if anyone else would like to make a toast, I half raised my hand, but somehow the microphone never made it to me. The moment passed, and with it, my chance to publicly express my love for the granddaughter I'd helped raise. It was during the dancing when everything shifted. The DJ had just played Emma's favorite song, the one I used to sing to her when she was small, during those countless nights I babysat while Marcus and Sarah went out. I was standing near the gift table, watching her twirl in her white dress, when Sarah's mother approached me with that plastic bag. "I thought you might need this," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "For tomorrow. Sarah mentioned you were doing some cleaning work now to make ends meet." The words hit me like ice water. Lisa, who had been standing beside me, gasped audibly, but it was the laughter that cut deepest. My sister-in-law Karen's sharp cackle as she overheard the exchange, treating my humiliation as entertainment for her evening. I looked at the uniform through the clear plastic. Size large, bright blue polyester with Sparkle Clean Services embroidered across the chest pocket. The fabric felt cheap against my fingers. Nothing like the quality clothing I'd always prided myself on wearing. This was their opinion of me, their assessment of my worth. After decades of sacrifice, of putting their needs before my own, of draining my savings to fund their dreams, I had been reduced to someone they saw as the help. The rest of that evening passed in a haze of forced smiles and polite conversations. I danced with Robert during the anniversary dance, moving stiffly to music that no longer sounded romantic. He whispered apologies in my ear, but they felt empty, automatic. How long had he known this was how his family saw me? How long had he been complicit in my diminishment? When we finally returned to our small apartment on the south side, I sat in our living room still wearing my navy dress, the plastic bag containing the uniform on the coffee table before me. The silence between Robert and me stretched like a chasm. He poured himself a scotch and settled into his recliner, avoiding eye contact. "They didn't mean anything by it, Margaret," he finally said. "Sarah's mother just thought—" "Thought what?" I interrupted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Thought I was so desperate, so worthless that I'd be grateful for their charity? Their handout job suggestion?" He had no answer. After 42 years of marriage, my husband had no defense for his family's cruelty, no words of comfort for his wife's pain. He just sat there, sipping his drink, letting my humiliation settle around us like dust on forgotten furniture. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of our bedroom, listening to the familiar sounds of Chicago beyond our windows, the distant rumble of the L train on the elevated tracks, police sirens wailing down State Street, the hum of late-night traffic carrying people to places where they were valued, where they were seen, where they mattered. I thought about money, how it had shaped every relationship in my life, how my worth had been measured in dollars given and sacrifices made. Over the years, I'd drained my inheritance from my parents to help Marcus start his business. $15,000 from my mother's life insurance policy, gone in a month to cover his startup costs. When that failed, another $10,000 to keep him afloat, then his mortgage down payment, his car loan, Emma's private school tuition because the public schools weren't good enough for Sarah's standards. Each time, the requests came with promises. "I'll pay you back, Mom, as soon as things turn around." But things never turned around, and the debts were never mentioned again. They simply became part of my expected contribution to their lives, my fee for remaining in the family. I'd calculated it once, in a moment of bitter curiosity. Over 12 years, I'd given them more than $80,000. Money that could have secured my own retirement, that could have allowed Robert and me to travel, to enjoy our golden years without worrying about every grocery bill and utility payment. Instead, Marcus and Sarah lived in a beautiful suburban home while we stayed in the same cramped apartment we'd occupied since the 1980s. The irony wasn't lost on me that Sarah's mother, who could afford to mock my financial struggles, had never contributed a penny to her own daughter's welfare. She saved her money for exotic vacations and designer handbags while I sacrificed my security for theirs. But it wasn't just the money, was it? Money was just the easiest way to keep score in a game where I was always losing. It was the forgotten birthdays, the ignored invitations, the casual dismissal of my opinions and feelings. It was being treated like an employee in my own family, expected to serve without question and be grateful for the opportunity. I remember my 70th birthday 3 months earlier. I'd dropped hints for weeks, mentioning that I'd love to have a small family dinner, maybe at that Italian restaurant on Taylor Street, where we used to celebrate special occasions when the kids were young. The day came and went without acknowledgement. Not a call, not a card, not even a text message. When I finally heard from Marcus 2 days later, he acted surprised. "Oh, Mom, was that this week? Sarah and I were so busy with Emma's college applications." Emma, my granddaughter who was apparently too busy to remember the woman who'd attended every soccer game, every school play, every dance recital for 18 years. The same Emma who posted daily on social media about her adventures with Sarah's family, her shopping trips with Sarah's mother, her spring break vacation funded by Sarah's father's investment portfolio. I'd started noticing the pattern more clearly then. Every family photo posted online featured Sarah's relatives prominently. Every holiday gathering occurred at Sarah's parents' house. Every major decision was made in consultation with Sarah's family, while Robert and I were presented with facts after the conclusions had been reached. We weren't family members anymore. We were obligations. Background characters in their carefully curated lives, kept around for financial emergencies and babysitting duties, but excluded from the real intimacy of their inner circle. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee in our small kitchen, looking out the window at the gray October sky hanging low over Chicago. The city felt different somehow, as if I was seeing it clearly for the first time in years. The buildings looked sharper, more defined. The sounds from the street below seemed more purposeful. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Attorney James Patterson's number. He'd handled my mother's estate years ago, and I remembered him as a straightforward man who didn't waste time on pleasantries. His secretary answered on the second ring. "I'd like to schedule an appointment," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I need to discuss some financial and legal matters." "What type of matters, Mrs. Williams?" I looked at the plastic bag still sitting on our coffee table, the bright blue uniform visible through the clear plastic like a neon sign advertising my family's contempt. "Asset protection," I said, "and estate planning." The appointment was set for the following Thursday. 3 days to think, to plan, to prepare for a conversation I should have had years earlier. 3 days to decide whether I was ready to stop being the family's automatic teller machine and start being a person with boundaries, dignity, and self-respect. During those 3 days, I paid attention to things I'd been unconsciously ignoring for months. The way Marcus would call only when he needed something, his voice taking on that wheedling tone I'd come to recognize as the prelude to a financial request. The way Sarah would invite me to Emma's events only when they needed transportation or someone to handle the refreshments. The way Robert would disappear into his workshop whenever difficult conversations began, leaving me to navigate family conflicts alone. I also noticed Mrs. Garcia, my neighbor from 2 doors down. Rosa Garcia, a widow whose husband had died 5 years earlier, had been quietly observing my coming and going with the kind of attention that spoke of genuine concern rather than nosiness. On Wednesday morning, she knocked on my door with a plate of homemade tamales. "You've seemed sad lately, Margaret," she said in her soft but direct way. "I thought you might like some comfort food." We sat at my kitchen table, and something about her gentle presence loosened the knots in my chest. I found myself telling her about the wedding, about the uniform, about years of feeling like a stranger in my own family. She listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, her dark eyes full of understanding. "My daughter lives in Phoenix," Rosa told me as we finished our coffee. "She calls every few months asking for money for her children's activities. Dance lessons, soccer camps, all very expensive. For a long time, I sent what I could, even when it meant I couldn't afford my medications some months." "What changed?" She smiled, but it was a sad smile, full of hard-won wisdom. I realized I was teaching her that love could be purchased, that my only value was what I could provide. When I stopped sending money, she stopped calling. It hurt, but it also freed me to discover who I was beyond being someone's automatic yes. Rosa's words stayed with me as I walked to Attorney Patterson's office on Thursday morning. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. Michigan Avenue bustled with people pursuing their own purposes, their own goals, their own definitions of success and happiness. Patterson's office occupied the 15th floor of a building near Grant Park, with windows that offered a view of Lake Michigan stretching to the horizon. The attorney himself was smaller than I remembered, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He listened as I explained my situation, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. "Let me understand this correctly," he said when I finished. "You've provided approximately $80,000 in direct financial support to your son and his family over the past 12 years, with no formal agreements about repayment." "That's correct." "And you currently have how much remaining in savings and investment accounts?" The number was embarrassing. After a lifetime of work, after my parents' inheritance, after years of careful budgeting, I had less than $25,000 to my name. Robert had his pension and Social Security, but together we were far from financially secure. "Mrs. Williams," Patterson said gently, "what you're describing isn't unusual. Many clients your age have found themselves in similar situations. The question is, what would you like to do about it?" I thought about the uniform, about Emma's wedding photos that would forever exclude me from the central narrative, about the lonely birthday that had passed unnoticed. "I want to protect what I have left," I said, "and I want to make some changes to my estate planning." We spent 2 hours discussing options: living trusts, revised wills, power of attorney documents. Patterson explained how I could restructure my assets to ensure they would be available for my own care in old age, rather than being presumed available for my family's convenience. "There's something else," I said as we concluded our meeting. "They don't know about my grandmother's jewelry collection." Patterson raised his eyebrows. "Tell me more." My maternal grandmother had been a woman of modest means but excellent taste. Over her lifetime, she'd accumulated a small but valuable collection of antique jewelry, pieces that had appreciated significantly over the decades. When she died, she'd left them specifically to me, not to be shared or sold, but preserved for future generations of women in our family. I'd kept them in a safety deposit box for 22 years, planning eventually to pass them to Emma when she was mature enough to appreciate their history and value. But Emma was 18 now, and she'd never once asked about her great-great-grandmother's legacy. She was too busy posting Instagram photos of the expensive jewelry Sarah's parents bought her for birthdays and holidays. "I had them appraised last year," I told Patterson. "They're worth about $40,000. He nodded thoughtfully. "And you're reconsidering who should inherit them?" "I'm reconsidering everything." Walking home from Patterson's office, I felt different. Not necessarily better, but clearer, lighter. For the first time in years, I'd taken action on my own behalf without consulting anyone else, without seeking approval or permission. The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. That evening, Marcus called. "Hey, Mom, quick question. Emma needs a new laptop for college and the good ones are pretty expensive. Could you help us out? Maybe $2,000? We'll pay you back after Christmas." The old Margaret would have said yes immediately, would have felt honored to be trusted with such an important request. But I found myself pausing, thinking about Patterson's questions, about Rosa's words, about the bright blue uniform that still sat in my closet like evidence of their true feelings about me. "Let me think about it," I said. Silence on the other end of the line. Marcus clearly hadn't expected anything but immediate compliance. "Think about it? Mom, it's for Emma's education. Don't you want her to succeed?" The guilt felt familiar, the emotional manipulation so practiced it was almost artistic. But instead of the usual knot in my stomach, I felt something else. Clarity. Of course I want her to succeed, I said. But I also need to consider my own financial security. Let me think about it and get back to you. Fine, Marcus said, his tone cooling noticeably. But don't wait too long. The semester starts soon. After he hung up, Robert looked at me from his chair. That was different, he observed. Yes, I agreed. It was. Over the following weeks, I began implementing small changes in my daily routine. Instead of automatically saying yes to every request, I started using phrases Patterson had suggested. Let me check my budget. I'll need to think about that. That's not going to work for me right now. The responses from my family were immediate and revealing. Marcus grew irritable when I didn't instantly agree to fund Emma's spring break trip. Sarah stopped inviting me to family dinners when I couldn't contribute expensive dishes or pay for the wine. Even Emma, my beloved granddaughter, became noticeably cooler when I explained that I couldn't buy her Christmas list in its entirety. But something unexpected happened alongside their withdrawal. I started noticing other people in my life more clearly. Rosa became a real friend, someone who enjoyed my company for its own sake, rather than for what I could provide. My book club at the library took on new importance as I engaged more fully in discussions, rather than worrying about rushing home to handle some family emergency. I also started paying attention to my own interests again. I'd always loved art history, but had never had time to pursue it seriously. I enrolled in an evening class at the community college, something I hadn't done in 30 years. The professor was a passionate woman in her 50s who spoke about Renaissance painters with the kind of enthusiasm I'd forgotten was possible. During our third class, as we studied Caravaggio's use of light and shadow, I realized the metaphor was perfect for my own life. I'd been living in shadow for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to step into the light, to be the central figure in my own existence rather than background illumination for others' stories. The revelation was crystallizing when Christmas arrived. Sarah's family planned their usual elaborate celebration at her parents' house in Lincoln Park. The invitation, when it finally came, was casual to the point of rudeness. We're doing Christmas at Mom and Dad's again. Bring a dessert and something for Emma. See you at 2. No consultation about the date. No question about whether we had other plans. No acknowledgement that this was our family too, that we might want to host occasionally, or at least be included in the planning process. I made my grandmother's famous apple pie and bought Emma a thoughtful but modestly priced book about art history. When we arrived at the imposing brick house in Lincoln Park, I noticed immediately that the gift table groaned under expensive packages wrapped in coordinated paper and elaborate bows. My simple offerings looked shabby by comparison. The day followed its predictable pattern. Sarah's family dominated conversations, while Robert and I sat politely on the periphery. Her father held court with stories about his latest investment successes. Apparently, his cryptocurrency portfolio had performed exceptionally well, adding hundreds of thousands to his already substantial wealth. Her mother showed off the new diamond bracelet he'd given her, probably worth more than I'd live on for 2 years. When gift opening time arrived, Emma tore through packages with practiced efficiency. Designer clothes, expensive electronics, jewelry, gift cards to upscale stores. When she reached my book, she glanced at it briefly and set it aside without comment, reaching immediately for the next shiny package. I felt the familiar sting of invisibility, but this time it was accompanied by something else. A cold, clear assessment of the situation. These people had wealth that made my contributions meaningless in practical terms. Sarah's father could have bought Emma's laptop without thinking about it. Her mother could have funded the spring break trip from her jewelry budget alone. Yet they continued to come to me for money, not because they needed it, but because it had become expected. I was their personal charitable cause, the family member whose savings existed for their convenience. After dinner, as I helped clear dishes in the kitchen, I overheard a conversation that changed everything. Sarah was talking to her sister about spring break plans. We're looking at this amazing resort in Turks and Caicos. It's expensive, but Margaret will probably help with Emma's portion. She always does." Her sister laughed. "God, you're lucky. My mother-in-law guards her money like Fort Knox. I can't even get her to pay for her own grandchildren's birthday gifts." "I know, right?" Marcus says she's gotten a little weird about it lately, wanting to think about things instead of just saying yes. But she'll come around. She always does. Where else is she going to spend her money anyway? The casual cruelty of it, the assumption of my compliance, the dismissive assessment of my worth, it all crystallized in that moment. I wasn't their family member. I wasn't even their friend. I was their resource, their safety net, their reliable funding source for whatever lifestyle choices they wanted to make. I set down the plates I'd been holding and walked quietly to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. In the mirror, I saw a 70-year-old woman with kind eyes and silver hair, wearing a dress she'd bought on sale and jewelry that was older than her granddaughter. I saw someone who had spent decades prioritizing other people's happiness over her own financial security and emotional well-being. But I also saw someone who didn't have to continue making that choice. When we left that evening, Sarah's mother pressed another plastic bag into my hands. This time it contained leftover food, charitable scraps from their abundant table, packaged like donations to the needy. "I know you and Robert probably don't cook much for yourselves," she said with false concern. "This way you'll have some nice meals for the rest of the week." The parallel to the uniform incident wasn't lost on me. Once again, I was being positioned as the recipient of their charity rather than a contributing member of the family gathering. The message was clear. We see you as needy, dependent, grateful for whatever scraps we choose to throw your way. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Patterson's office first thing Monday morning and scheduled another appointment. When I arrived, I brought documents I'd been gathering for weeks. Bank statements, loan records, photographs, even printouts of social media posts that illustrated the stark difference between my family's lifestyle and my own financial reality. "I want to make some significant changes," I told him. We spent 3 hours restructuring my financial life. I moved my remaining assets into a trust that would provide for my own care while making it impossible for family members to pressure me for loans or gifts. I revised my will to leave my grandmother's jewelry to a museum rather than to Emma, along with a note explaining the decision. Most importantly, I instructed Patterson to prepare a formal letter that would communicate my new boundaries to my family. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Williams?" he asked as we concluded our business. "These changes will significantly impact your relationships." I thought about Emma tossing my book aside, about Sarah's casual assumption that my money would fund her vacation plans, about Marcus's irritation when I dared to hesitate before agreeing to his requests. "My relationships are already significantly impacted," I said. "I'm just acknowledging the reality rather than pretending things are different than they are." The letter was delivered on a Thursday in February, during one of Chicago's brutal winter storms. Snow piled against windows while winds howled down the streets, creating the kind of weather that kept people indoors and forced them to confront uncomfortable truths they might otherwise avoid. Patterson had crafted the document carefully, using legal language that left no room for misinterpretation while maintaining a tone of dignity and finality. It explained that I would no longer be providing financial support of any kind, that my assets were being managed in a trust for my own care, and that future requests for money would not be considered. Marcus called within 2 hours, his voice tight with anger and disbelief. "Mom, what the hell is this? Some lawyer's letter saying you won't help us anymore? What's gotten into you?" I had prepared for this conversation, had rehearsed my responses with the kind of care I usually reserved for family gift purchases. "I'm protecting my financial security," I said calmly. "I've reached an age where I need to focus on my own care rather than continuing to subsidize other people's lifestyle choices." "Subsidize? Mom, we're your family. This is what families do for each other." "Really? What exactly has this family done for me lately? The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Marcus had no ready answer, no examples of support or care flowing in my direction, no evidence that this family relationship was anything more than a one-way transaction. "You're being manipulated by that lawyer," he said finally. "This isn't like you. You've always been generous, always put family first." "I've always put your family first," I corrected. "There's a difference." Sarah tried a different approach when she called the next day, her voice honey-sweet with manufactured concern. "Margaret, I'm worried about you. This letter doesn't sound like something you'd write. Are you feeling okay? Maybe you should see a doctor. Make sure you're thinking clearly." The implication that my newfound boundaries indicated mental incompetence was both insulting and revealing. In Sarah's world, apparently, the only explanation for my refusal to continue funding their lifestyle was cognitive decline. "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years," I said. "Clear enough to realize that healthy relationships don't depend on one person always giving while the other always takes." "But we don't always take. We include you in family events. We invite you to celebrations. You invite me to serve at celebrations. There's a difference between being included and being used." The conversation deteriorated quickly after that, with Sarah cycling through anger, guilt, and threats, before finally hanging up when none of her usual tactics produced the desired result. Emma's response came via text message, brief and cutting. "I guess I know where I stand now. Thanks for nothing, Grandma." Each word felt like a small knife, precisely aimed at the parts of my heart that had always been most vulnerable to her approval. But alongside the pain, I felt something else. Relief. The mask was finally off, the pretense finally abandoned. She was showing me exactly how much my love meant when it wasn't accompanied by financial contributions. Robert's reaction was more complex and more difficult to navigate. He didn't disagree with my decisions, but he was terrified of the consequences. "They're going to cut us off completely," he said as we sat in our living room, listening to the wind rattle our windows. "We won't see Emma graduate, won't be invited to future weddings, won't be part of their lives anymore." "Were we ever really part of their lives?" I asked. "Or were we just convenient resources they kept around for emergencies?" He didn't answer immediately, but I could see him thinking, remembering, evaluating years of interactions that had felt normal at the time, but looked different in retrospect. "I keep thinking about Emma's graduation party last year," he said eventually. "The one they held at Sarah's parents' house. We weren't mentioned in any of the speeches, weren't thanked for helping pay for her private school, weren't acknowledged at all. At the time, I thought they just forgot. But now you realize they didn't forget. They just don't consider our contributions worth acknowledging." The next few weeks passed in a strange kind of peace. Without constant financial requests interrupting my days, without the stress of figuring out how to stretch my budget to accommodate their latest crisis, I found myself with mental and emotional energy I'd forgotten I possessed. I started volunteering at the Chicago History Museum, using my art history knowledge to help with educational programs. The work was meaningful in a way I hadn't experienced in years, contributing to something larger than myself while being appreciated for my knowledge rather than my wallet. Rosa and I began taking weekly walks along the lakefront, talking about everything from politics to poetry to the challenges of aging in a society that often dismisses older women's voices. These conversations filled parts of my soul that had been empty for too long. But the real transformation came in April, during what would have been Emma's spring break trip to Turks and Caicos. I had expected to feel sad, imagining my granddaughter enjoying experiences I wasn't helping to fund. Instead, I found myself planning my own adventure. Using money I would have previously sent to Marcus's family, I booked a long weekend in New Orleans, a city I'd always wanted to visit but never prioritized over other people's needs. The French Quarter charmed me immediately with its wrought iron balconies and jazz music spilling from every doorway. I stayed in a small hotel near Jackson Square, walking the historic streets with the kind of leisurely appreciation that comes from having nowhere else to be and no one else's agenda to accommodate. On my second evening, I sat in a cafe listening to a jazz trio and sipping wine that cost more than I usually spent on groceries for a week. The music was complex and beautiful, full of improvisation and emotional depth that spoke to something in me that had been silent too long. An elderly gentleman at the next table struck up a conversation about the musicians, and we ended up talking for hours about music, travel, and the strange freedom that comes with reaching an age where other people's opinions matter less than your own peace of mind. "I raised 5 children," he told me over our second bottle of wine. "Spent 40 years putting their needs first, their wants first, their dreams first. When my wife died 3 years ago, I realized I'd forgotten how to want things for myself. This trip is part of remembering." His words resonated so deeply that I found myself crying right there in the cafe, not from sadness, but from recognition. Here was someone who understood the particular kind of loss that comes from spending decades as a supporting character in other people's stories. When I returned to Chicago, I felt fundamentally changed. Not bitter or angry, but clear about my own worth and tired of apologizing for taking up space in my own life. The change was apparently visible to others as well. Rosa commented on how much more relaxed I seemed. My volunteer supervisor at the museum mentioned that I appeared more confident during educational presentations. Even Robert noticed a difference, though he couldn't quite articulate what had shifted. The test of my transformation came in May, when Marcus called with what he clearly expected to be an irresistible request. "Mom, I have incredible news. I've been offered a partnership opportunity with this tech startup. It's a ground floor chance to get involved with artificial intelligence development. But I need to invest $50,000 to secure my position." The old Margaret would have panicked about not having that much money available, would have agonized over disappointing him, would have looked for ways to liquidate assets or borrow against future income to make his dream possible. The new Margaret listened calmly and said, "That sounds exciting for you. I hope you're able to find the funding you need." Silence. Then confusion. "Mom, I'm asking if you can help me with the investment." "I understand what you're asking, and I'm telling you that I can't help with that." "Can't or won't?" The question was designed to make me feel guilty, to imply that my refusal was based on selfishness rather than necessity. But I'd learned to recognize manipulation tactics and was no longer susceptible to them. "Both," I said simply. "I don't have that kind of money available, and even if I did, I wouldn't invest in ventures that have no guarantee of return." "Jesus, Mom, what happened to you? You used to care about our success, used to want to help us build a better life." "I still want you to succeed, but I've learned the difference between helping and enabling. Real help teaches people to solve their own problems. What I was doing before was just making it easier for you to avoid taking responsibility for your choices." The conversation ended badly, as I'd expected it would. But something interesting happened over the following weeks. Instead of the family rallying around Marcus to pressure me into compliance, cracks began appearing in their united front. Lisa, who had been largely silent during my financial transformation, called with an unexpected perspective. "I've been thinking about what happened at Emma's wedding," she said. "That thing with the uniform. It was cruel, Mom. I should have said something at the time, but I was shocked into silence." We talked for 2 hours, the longest conversation we'd had in years. Lisa shared her own frustrations with the family dynamics, her feelings of being overshadowed by Marcus's constant financial dramas, her resentment about being expected to defer to Sarah's family in all social situations. "I make more money than Marcus does," she told me. "My husband and I are financially stable. We've never asked you for help. And we've always contributed equally to family expenses when we visit." but somehow Sarah's parents are treated like the important in-laws while we're afterthoughts. Her observations helped me see the broader pattern I'd been part of. It wasn't just about money, though money was certainly a factor. It was about power and status and the subtle ways families establish hierarchies that benefit some members at the expense of others. June brought Emma's college graduation, an event I learned about through a social media post rather than a personal invitation. The ceremony was held at Northwestern University's beautiful Lakeshore campus, and part of me ached to miss this milestone in my granddaughter's life. But I also recognized that my absence was a natural consequence of boundaries I'd established for my own well-being. I couldn't expect to be included in celebrations after declining to fund the education being celebrated. The disappointment was real, but so was the peace that came from not spending money I couldn't afford on people who didn't value my presence beyond my contributions. Instead of attending Emma's graduation, I spent that weekend helping Rosa organize her late husband's workshop. He'd been a carpenter, and she'd been avoiding the emotional task of sorting through his tools and unfinished projects. Working alongside her, handling wood that still carried the scent of his pipe tobacco, listening to stories about their 50-year marriage, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from being genuinely useful rather than merely profitable. "You know what I've learned since Eduardo died?" Rosa asked as we wrapped his hand tools in protective cloth. "Love isn't about what you can do for people. Love is about being present with them in their reality, not trying to change or fix or improve their circumstances." Her words crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't articulated. For years, I'd confused wealth transfer with love, had measured my worth as a family member by my willingness to solve other people's financial problems. But real love, the kind that nourishes relationships rather than creating dependency, required something more complex and more sustainable. The revelation came with a mixture of grief and relief. Grief for the years I'd wasted trying to purchase affection that should have been freely given. Relief at finally understanding that genuine relationships couldn't be maintained through financial transactions. Summer passed peacefully. I developed a routine that centered around my own interests and needs rather than other people's emergencies. Morning coffee on our small balcony, reading books I'd been meaning to get to for decades, afternoon volunteer work at the museum, evening walks with Rosa, or quiet dinners with Robert, who was slowly adjusting to our new family dynamics. The real test came in August, when Sarah called with news that would have previously sent me into a panic of guilt and worry. "Margaret, I wanted you to know that Marcus lost his job. The company downsized, and he was part of the layoffs. We're going to be fine financially, but Emma's starting her senior year and we're concerned about tuition money." The pause that followed was clearly intended to give me time to offer help. When I didn't immediately respond, Sarah continued. "I know you've been dealing with some issues lately, but this is Emma's education we're talking about. Surely you wouldn't want her to have to leave school because of money problems." The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. Marcus and Sarah lived in a house worth more than $400,000. They drove cars with payments higher than my monthly rent. Sarah's jewelry collection alone was worth more than my annual income. Yet they expected me to drain my limited resources to maintain their daughter's expensive private education while they preserved their own assets. "I'm sorry to hear about Marcus's job," I said. "That must be stressful for your family. I'm sure you'll figure out how to handle Emma's tuition." "Figure out how to handle it? Margaret, we can't afford $40,000 a year without help. Are you really going to let your granddaughter suffer because you've decided to be selfish with your money?" The word selfish was the final insult. Selfish to want financial security in my old age. Selfish to expect healthy relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation. Selfish to value my own well-being alongside theirs. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady and clear, "you and Marcus have spent years making expensive choices while assuming I would cover the consequences. You chose the private school knowing you couldn't afford it long-term. You chose the lifestyle, the house, the cars, all of it, with my money as your safety net. But family helps family. Real family helps each other. This family has spent 12 years expecting me to help while offering nothing in return. Emma is an adult now. If her education is important to you, you'll find a way to pay for it that doesn't involve draining an elderly woman's savings. I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking but my mind clear. The aftermath was swift and predictable. Within a week, I was blocked on all social media accounts. Family photos that had included me were cropped or replaced. When I called Emma directly to wish her luck with her senior year, the call went straight to voicemail. My number had been blocked. The silence was devastating and liberating simultaneously. Devastating because it confirmed what I'd suspected, but hoped, wasn't true. Their affection had been entirely conditional on my financial usefulness. Liberating because I no longer had to pretend otherwise, no longer had to exhaust myself trying to earn love that wasn't available at any price. Robert struggled more than I did with the complete cutoff. He'd lost his son, his daughter-in-law, and his granddaughter in one fell swoop, all because his wife had dared to establish financial boundaries. "Maybe if you just helped with part of the tuition," he suggested one evening as we ate dinner. "Maybe if you showed some willingness to compromise, they'd soften their position." I looked at my husband of 42 years, this man who had watched his family treat his wife with casual cruelty for over a decade, and I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. "Robert," I said, "if you think the solution to this situation is for me to give in to financial blackmail, then you've learned nothing from the past year. The problem isn't my unwillingness to compromise. The problem is their belief that love can be purchased and my worth is measured in dollars." He didn't argue further, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing his loyalty to me against his desire to maintain contact with Marcus's family. The fact that it was even a question told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in his priorities. September arrived with its crisp promises of change and renewal. Emma started her senior year, undoubtedly figuring out financial aid and scholarship options as thousands of students do every year. Marcus presumably found new employment or adjusted their lifestyle to match their actual income rather than their inflated expectations. I didn't know these details because I was no longer part of their equation, no longer the assumed solution to their self-created problems. The absence of constant financial crises created a space in my life I hadn't experienced in years. I used that space to reconnect with parts of myself I'd neglected during the decades of family service. I enrolled in a ceramics class, something I'd wanted to try since college but had never prioritized over other people's needs. The feel of clay between my fingers, the meditative process of shaping something beautiful from raw earth, fed parts of my soul that had been starving. My instructor was a woman named Jennifer, probably in her 40s, who had left a corporate career to pursue art full-time. Her story of prioritizing personal fulfillment over external expectations resonated with my own journey, though our circumstances were vastly different. "People always ask if I miss the money," she told our small class one evening as we worked at our wheels. "They never ask if I miss the ulcers, the insomnia, the constant feeling that I was living someone else's life. Money is just one way to keep score in a game that might not be worth playing." Her words echoed in my mind as I shaped my first successful bowl, a simple piece that was beautiful precisely because it was functional and honest. No pretense, no apology for existing, no attempt to be more or less than it was. October brought another wedding invitation, this one to the marriage of Rosa's nephew in Milwaukee. She asked if Robert and I would like to accompany her to the celebration, and I realized it had been months since anyone had invited me anywhere without expecting me to pay for the privilege. The wedding was lovely in its simplicity. A small church ceremony followed by dinner at a community center, decorated with flowers from family gardens and photos spanning multiple generations. Rosa's extended family welcomed Robert and me with genuine warmth, including us in conversations without agenda, appreciating our presence for its own sake. During the reception, I found myself dancing with Rosa's brother-in-law, a retired teacher who shared my interest in history and art. We talked about travels we'd taken and places we still hoped to see, about books that had changed our perspectives and experiences that had shaped our understanding of what mattered in life. "You know what I've learned about family?" he said as we swayed to an old song from the 1970s. "Blood doesn't make you family. Love and respect make you family." Some of my closest family members aren't related to me at all, and some of my relatives aren't really family in any meaningful sense. His observation felt like wisdom earned through experience rather than theory. Looking around the reception, I saw the truth of it everywhere. Rosa's family had embraced me not because I could provide anything for them, but because she cared about me, and people who love her chose to extend that caring to include me. It was everything my biological family had never offered: inclusion without expectation, warmth without transaction, acceptance without conditions. That night, in the hotel room Robert and I shared, I lay awake thinking about the strange paths life takes us down. A year earlier, I would have been devastated to miss Emma's senior year activities, would have felt guilty and anxious about not contributing to her education expenses. Now, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: peace with my own choices. The peace wasn't about not loving Emma or not caring about Marcus's employment situation. It was about finally understanding that love without boundaries becomes enabling, and enabling doesn't help anyone grow or heal or become their best selves. November approached with its promise of holidays that would look very different from previous years. No frantic shopping for expensive gifts I couldn't afford. No elaborate meal planning for people who saw my efforts as expected rather than appreciated. No walking on eggshells to avoid conflicts that might threaten my access to the grandchildren. Instead, Rosa and I planned a quiet Thanksgiving dinner for neighborhood friends who, like us, were creating new traditions after life had changed their original plans. Mrs. Chen from apartment 4B, whose children lived across the country. Mr. Rodriguez from the floor below, whose wife had died the previous spring. Jennifer from my ceramics class, who was spending her first holiday as a divorced woman. We gathered in Rosa's apartment, larger than mine, and filled with the comfortable clutter of a life fully lived. Everyone brought something to share, not because anyone demanded it, but because contributing felt natural when you were genuinely welcomed. The conversation ranged from current events to childhood memories, from travel stories to book recommendations. No one asked me for money or favors or solutions to problems they'd created for themselves. No one treated my presence as an obligation or my contributions as insufficient. For the first time in years, I felt like a whole person rather than a function. Margaret the individual, with her own thoughts and interests and stories worth sharing, rather than Margaret the grandmother, mother-in-law, ATM machine, who existed primarily to serve other people's needs. As December arrived, I received an unexpected call from Emma. Not the warm reconciliation I might have hoped for, but something more complex and honest. "Grandma Margaret," she said, her voice carrying new maturity, "I wanted to let you know that I've been thinking about things differently lately." She told me about her senior year, about learning to manage her own finances and apply for need-based aid, about discovering resources she'd never known existed because there had always been a grandmother willing to write checks. "I didn't realize how much you'd been helping us over the years," she said. "It wasn't until I had to figure things out myself that I understood how much money you must have given up for our benefit." I waited, uncertain where this conversation was heading. I also didn't realize how dismissive we'd been of your feelings and opinions. I've been watching how my friends interact with their grandparents, and I see now that what we had wasn't normal or healthy. The admission was more than I'd expected, more honest than I'd dared hope for. "I don't know if we can fix our relationship," Emma continued. "There's a lot of hurt and a lot of patterns that got established over years. But I wanted you to know that I'm starting to understand why you made the changes you made." We talked for an hour, carefully and honestly, without the financial pressure that had distorted every previous conversation. She didn't ask for money, and I didn't offer any. Instead, we talked about her classes, her future plans, her growing understanding of what it meant to be an adult responsible for her own choices. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was the beginning of something genuine, a relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial transaction. When I shared the conversation with Rosa during our evening walk, she smiled with the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching someone else's wisdom prove itself over time. "You planted seeds when you set those boundaries," she said. "Not everyone will learn from the experience, but some will." Emma is young enough to understand that healthy relationships require mutual respect. Christmas that year was quiet, but rich. Robert and I exchanged modest gifts and spent the morning at the Art Institute, wandering through galleries filled with work that had survived centuries because it was beautiful and honest rather than expensive or impressive. In the afternoon, we joined Rosa's improvised holiday gathering in the community room of our apartment building. Someone had brought a piano, and Mrs. Chen turned out to have a lovely voice for Christmas carols. Mr. Rodriguez shared stories about holidays in the Dominican Republic that made us laugh until our sides ached. As evening approached and our small party began to wind down, I found myself standing near the window that overlooked our neighborhood. Snow was falling softly, transforming the ordinary street into something magical and peaceful. Robert appeared beside me, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. I thought about Emma's wedding, about the uniform incident that had started this whole transformation, about the family relationships that had ended when I stopped funding them. About setting boundaries? No. About taking so long to set them? Many. We stood together in comfortable silence, watching our world be made new by the falling snow. It occurred to me that this was what peace felt like, not the absence of problems, but the presence of authentic relationships and the security that comes from self-respect. January brought a new year and new possibilities. I'd begun planning a trip to Italy, something I'd dreamed about for decades but had never prioritized over other people's financial needs. The art history tours, the cooking classes, the simple pleasure of experiencing beauty for its own sake, rather than as background for someone else's social media posts. My financial advisor, Patterson, had recommended someone who specialized in senior financial planning, showed me how my careful budgeting and boundary setting had actually improved my long-term security. Without the constant drain of family financial requests, my modest savings could support a more comfortable and independent aging process. "The money you were giving away wasn't helping them build wealth," he explained. "It was enabling them to live beyond their means while you lived below yours. That's not sustainable for anyone involved." The analysis confirmed what I'd suspected, but hadn't been able to articulate. My financial support had been preventing them from learning to manage their own resources while preventing me from securing my own future. February brought news that Marcus had found new employment, apparently at a salary comparable to his previous job. Sarah posted photos on social media. I'd unblocked them, though I no longer followed their accounts closely, showing Emma at various senior year events, looking happy and healthy and apparently managing her final semester successfully. The images stirred complex emotions. Joy at seeing my granddaughter thriving, sadness at not being part of her celebrations, relief at knowing they were solving their own problems without my financial intervention. Clarity about the difference between caring about someone and being responsible for their choices. March brought spring to Chicago, and with it, a kind of flowering in my own life I hadn't expected at 71 years old. My ceramics had improved to the point where Jennifer suggested I might want to sell some pieces at the summer art fair. The idea of being valued for something I'd created rather than something I could provide felt revolutionary. I'd also begun volunteering with a financial literacy program for seniors, helping other older adults recognize and resist financial abuse from family members. The stories I heard were heartbreakingly familiar, but I was able to offer something I'd never had during my own struggles. Perspective from someone who had successfully escaped the cycle. The hardest part, I told a support group one evening, isn't setting the boundaries. It's accepting that some relationships can't survive healthy boundaries because they were never based on genuine affection in the first place. April brought Emma's 22nd birthday, a milestone I marked privately with a card sent to her dorm address. Inside, I'd written a simple message, wishing you joy and wisdom as you continue becoming the woman you're meant to be. With love, Grandma Margaret. She texted back a brief thank you, and I found myself grateful for even that small acknowledgement. We were building something new, slowly and carefully, without the distortion of financial pressure or family obligations. May brought graduation announcements, which I received in the mail like any distant relative or family friend. The formal card requested no gifts, mentioned no celebration details, simply informed me that Emma would be graduating magna cum laude with a degree in environmental science. I felt proud of her accomplishment and peaceful about my role in it. I had contributed to her education significantly over many years. The fact that I hadn't paid for her final year didn't diminish the foundation I'd helped provide, and her success proved that young people could indeed solve their own problems when they weren't taught to expect others to handle their responsibilities. June brought the first anniversary of my financial transformation, and I marked it quietly by reviewing the changes in my life. Better relationships with people who valued me as a person, improved financial security, new interests and skills I'd developed when I wasn't constantly managing other people's crises. A sense of self-worth that didn't depend on other people's approval or gratitude. Most importantly, I'd learned the difference between supporting people you love and enabling their refusal to grow. Real love sometimes requires disappointment. Real support sometimes means stepping back and allowing others to develop their own capabilities. July brought a surprise phone call from Marcus. His voice was different somehow, less entitled and more reflective than I'd heard in years. "Mom, I've been doing some thinking about the past few years, about how our relationship changed and why." I waited, curious about where this conversation might lead. "I want you to know that I understand now why you made the changes you made. It took losing your support to realize how much I'd been depending on it, and how unfair that was to you." The admission was more than I'd expected, more honest than our family dynamics had encouraged in the past. "I've been going to therapy," he continued, "working on understanding why I felt entitled to your money, why I got so angry when you started saying no. It's complicated, but part of it was that I never learned to see you as a separate person with your own needs and limitations." We talked for over an hour, a real conversation for the first time in years. He didn't ask for money or favors, didn't try to manipulate me into resuming my old patterns. Instead, he shared his growing understanding of how family relationships should be balanced and mutual rather than one-sided. It wasn't a complete healing, but it was a beginning, a foundation for something healthier than what we'd had before. August approached with news that Emma had found her first post-graduation job with an environmental consulting firm in Portland. She was moving across the country, starting her adult life in a city where she knew no one, building her independence in ways that reminded me of my own recent transformation. We exchanged a few emails about her move, carefully friendly correspondence that felt genuine in its lack of financial undertones. She was excited about her work, nervous about the distance from family, optimistic about the future she was creating for herself. In her last email before the move, she wrote something that touched me deeply. "Thank you for teaching me that love isn't about what people can do for you. It took me a while to understand that lesson, but I think I'm finally getting it." September brought the kind of clarity that comes with time and distance. I could see now that the wedding incident, the uniform, the laughter, the humiliation, had been the catalyst for changes that needed to happen regardless. The cruelty had been real, but it had also been revelatory, showing me truths about my family relationships that I might never have acknowledged otherwise. I wasn't grateful for the humiliation, but I was grateful for the self-knowledge it had forced upon me. Sometimes life's worst moments become the doorways to its best transformations. October brought my first trip to Italy, the journey I'd been planning and saving for throughout my year of boundary setting. Rome, Florence, Venice, cities I'd studied in art history books but never imagined I'd experience in person. Walking through the Uffizi Gallery, standing before Botticelli's Birth of Venus, I felt a profound sense of completion. Here I was, a 71-year-old woman from Chicago, experiencing one of the world's greatest art treasures, not because someone else had funded the trip or approved of my dreams, but because I had valued myself enough to make it happen. The other travelers in my tour group were mostly couples or friends, but I found myself comfortable with my solo status. I'd learned over the past year that being alone wasn't the same as being lonely, and that my own company could be both peaceful and stimulating when I wasn't constantly worried about managing other people's emotions or expectations. In a small cafe in Florence, jet-lagged but exhilarated, I wrote postcards to the people who had supported my transformation: Rosa, Jennifer from ceramics class, Patterson the attorney, the women in my financial abuse support group, people who had seen my worth when I'd forgotten it myself, who had encouraged my boundaries when my family had criticized them. To Emma, I sent a postcard of Michelangelo's David with a simple message: thinking of you as you start your new life in Portland. Some of the most beautiful things in the world were created through struggle and patience. Love, Grandma Margaret. November brought Thanksgiving again, and this time I hosted the gathering in my own apartment. Rosa helped me cook, and we welcomed the same collection of neighborhood misfits who had become my chosen family over the past 2 years. During our informal toast, I found myself reflecting on the strange mathematics of gratitude. 2 years earlier, I'd had more money in my bank account but less security in my heart. I'd had closer proximity to my biological family, but less authentic connection. I'd had fewer boundaries but more stress, less self-respect, but more people willing to take advantage of my generosity. The trade-offs had been worth it. Every difficult conversation, every moment of loneliness, every doubt about whether I was being too harsh or too selfish, all of it had been worth the peace I now carried in my chest like a steady flame. December approached with its promise of Christmas, and I found myself genuinely looking forward to the holiday, rather than dreading its emotional and financial pressures. My gift-giving was modest, but thoughtful, focused on people who appreciated my presence rather than my presence. On Christmas Eve, I received a package from Portland. Inside was a small ceramic bowl, clearly handmade, with a note from Emma. I've been taking pottery classes here. This made me think of you and your art. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to discover new parts of yourself. Love and respect, Emma. The bowl was imperfect in the way that handmade things are, with slightly uneven walls and a glaze that varied in thickness. It was also beautiful in its honesty, its willingness to be itself without apology. I placed it on my kitchen windowsill where the morning light would touch it every day, a reminder of the granddaughter I'd helped raise and the woman she was becoming on her own terms. As the year drew to a close, I found myself thinking about the nature of transformation, how it rarely happens all at once, but rather in small daily choices to value yourself enough to set boundaries, to prioritize your own well-being alongside others, to recognize that healthy relationships require mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. The woman who had trembled while holding that plastic bag at Emma's wedding felt like someone I'd known long ago, rather than who I'd been just 18 months earlier. That woman had been so hungry for acceptance that she'd confused being needed with being loved, had measured her worth in dollars, given rather than respect received. This woman, the one I'd become, understood that love without boundaries becomes enabling, that sacrifice without reciprocity becomes martyrdom, and that family relationships that can't survive honesty weren't authentic relationships to begin with. On New Year's Eve, Rosa and I sat on my small balcony despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and sharing a bottle of wine while we watched fireworks bloom over Lake Michigan. The city stretched out before us, full of people making resolutions and promises they might or might not keep. "Any wishes for the new year?" Rosa asked as the last fireworks faded into the dark sky. I thought about it carefully. What did I want that I didn't already have? More time with people who valued me? I had that. Financial security? I'd achieved that through careful boundary setting. Peace with my choices? That had been the greatest gift of this whole difficult journey. Continued clarity, I said finally. The wisdom to keep choosing my own well-being over other people's comfort. The strength to maintain healthy boundaries even when they disappoint people I love. Rosa nodded thoughtfully. You know what I've learned watching your transformation. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's refusal to grow. You gave Emma and Marcus a gift when you stopped solving their problems for them, even though they couldn't see it at the time. As we gathered our empty glasses and prepared to go inside, I caught sight of my reflection in the sliding door. A 72-year-old woman with silver hair and laugh lines, wearing a warm coat that she'd bought for herself without consulting anyone else's opinion about the expense. Her eyes were clear and peaceful. Her posture was straight and confident. She looked like someone who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to claim the space she deserved in the world. She looked like someone I was proud to be. Standing there in the cold Chicago air, surrounded by the lights of the city I'd called home for more than 4 decades, I felt a deep sense of completion. Not the kind that comes from reaching the end of a story, but the kind that comes from finally beginning to live authentically. The uniform incident at Emma's wedding had been intended as humiliation, a cruel reminder of what they saw as my place in the family hierarchy. Instead, it had become the moment I stopped accepting a place that diminished my dignity and worth. Sometimes the cruelest gifts turn out to be the most transformative. Sometimes the people who hurt us most deeply teach us the most important lessons about what we will and won't accept in our lives. Sometimes losing relationships that were based on financial transaction clears space for relationships based on genuine affection and mutual respect. And sometimes, at 72 years old, you discover that it's never too late to stop being who others expect you to be and start being who you actually are. If there's one thing I want you to take away from my story, it's this. Your worth isn't measured by what you can provide for others. Your value isn't determined by your willingness to sacrifice your security for someone else's comfort. You deserve relationships that appreciate your presence, not just your presence. It took me 7 decades to learn these lessons, but they've made the years since then richer and more authentic than all the years that came before. The woman who was handed that cleaning uniform and chose to see it as a message about her worth has been replaced by a woman who knows her value isn't up for debate. Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where your worth was measured by what you could provide rather than who you were as a person? Have you ever had to choose between financial security and family approval? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful healing comes from knowing we're not alone in our struggles, that others have walked similar paths and found their way to healthier boundaries and greater self-respect. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to help these messages reach others who might need to hear them. Sometimes a single story can be the catalyst someone needs to begin their own transformation, to start valuing themselves enough to demand the respect they deserve. Thank you for listening to my journey from humiliation to liberation, from being used to being valued, from sacrifice without boundaries to love with self-respect. The woman I am today is grateful to the woman I was then for finally saying, enough, even when it was the hardest thing she'd ever done.